Om Sadashiva Samarambam Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Payantam Vande Guru Param Vishwaro Guratmeti Moti Veda Vibhagine Vyomada Vyaptadehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha Sava Vedanta Sedanta Gocharam Tamagocharam Govindam Paramanandam Satguru Pranatosh Maham Om Om Shanti 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 Namaste. Welcome. We are back with Panchadasi. We saw the summary of space, existence, discrimination. So we may be making an effort to discriminate consciousness or space from consciousness or vice versa, being space, the first manifestation coming out of Maya Ishvara, as we know. They introduce the three elements, and out of the three elements, we have the subtle elements being formed, and then space, and out of space, the sense organ of space begins, and so on. Space is the first of the five basic primary elements, and we are discriminate space from consciousness because they seem to be so intimately connected that it's easy somehow to make this confusion. In fact, in the spiritual world, people tend to confuse space, akasha, because they believe that akasha is the bottom line, is the end of the road, because when you look back from density, of phenomenal objects, and then you go back in the end, you find emptiness or space, and then we think, okay, everything comes out of emptiness. But that's not really the case, although it does come from space, because space brings about the other four elements. But as we know, space comes from Maya, Maya comes from Brahman, or consciousness, or Satchitananda. So we have seen last week that we experience space. We must learn to appreciate existence as the substance. So existence, consciousness, in this case, existence of space, since space is not a sentient being. If space would be a sentient being, we would be talking in terms of consciousness, discriminate consciousness and space. But space is not. Only the Jivatma is a sentient being. I mean, there are other Jivas that are also sentient beings. But as far as self-knowledge, so we are dealing here with something that is relevant only to human beings. So we must learn to appreciate the existence of space as the substance, and the space is as a byproduct of consciousness. Out of space, out of existence comes space. Space is the properties, okay, and it's not the other way around. It's not that space is and then existence is a property of space, but no, existence is and space is a property of existence, okay? It's very simple. We have looked into that. And then the number two here is to appreciate the existence principle as independent. So there were three features that we need to keep in mind. This goes to every object. We need to understand that there is an existence, and the object, whatsoever object, each and all of the five elements, they are properties of existence, okay? It's not that each one of those properties have existence as their properties. No, existence comes in the first place, and then each one of the of the 5 elements, they come out as properties, okay? So, and then we need to keep in mind that between existence and these properties that come out of the existence of Brahman, cooked up by Maya Ishvara. So one factor is free and independent, and the other enjoys a borrowed existence. A borrowed existence is almost as good as non-existence. Why? Because if you depend on something to exist, just imagine if we would be really under the spell of ignorance and we say, I depend on the body for the existence, physical body to exist. And then, what's the good of this existence that depends on something which is bound by time? So we need to understand that existence is the substance, okay, is the reality, is the isness, okay? And existence is a principle which is free and independent from any and all properties, okay? Appreciate the existence principle as an independent principle, not a dependent principle, not a byproduct. Space depends on existence, okay? So this is the second thing we need to keep in mind. And then the third point they say here is that we need to also appreciate the property of any and all object as mithya. And then we have a clear understanding of what is mithya. Mithya from this angle is something that exists, but exists dependently. It enjoys a certain level of existence which depends on some other principles, and many principles sometimes. When we go all the way down to the element called earth, the most dense element in creation of the primary element, in that element, it exists, it enjoys existence, but it's borrowing existence from the previous elements, one by one, by one, by one, and then in the end, it's borrowing space, the elements, the sound, and certain aspects of space, to itself. So it has space, it has fire, water, air, fire, water, and then we have the earth. So it's totally dependent on the other elements, and it's dependent on Mr. Maya, and then the Lord Ishvara, and it's dependent on Brahman. So mithya is that in this context which enjoys a dependent existence, it's not a good way to exist. Every human being who exists as the body is existing, depending on the body, and that creates great fear, as we know. Okay, we appreciate the property of any object as mithya. Seeing the world as mithya is freedom. If you know what is real and what is not real, and then you are free, okay? You are free, why? Because this exists, but it's just an appearance, It's just something that appears, but it's not really real, and I cannot rely on those things. I cannot rely on anything that I see or experience, because anything I see and experience is mithya. So I appreciate that all properties of Brahman, all properties of existence is mithya, okay? All properties. Seeing the world as mithya frees the seer of the world as satya, okay? So I have discriminated satya from mithya. Mithya is any and all things I see, witness, experience, and know. So I see the world as mithya, and then I am free and independent from all properties of Mr. Maya. If the world enjoys the same order reality as I do, I will feel attached to the world, dependent on the world, because I have project reality on the world. I am Satya, I am real. The world is mithya. Is very important to keep that in mind. I will have to depend on objects for my happiness. If awareness, consciousness, is without properties or qualities, meaning nirguna, then space cannot be real, or it would lend its properties, sound, and accommodation to consciousness. So what it says here, if consciousness, as we know, is nirguna, which is free of any property, it's the only principle that does not have any attributes. So if awareness is without any properties, then space cannot be real, because as we know, space has property, and then space would be on the same order as awareness, and then it will be impact awareness, and somehow the properties of space would be transferred, or just try to to impact satya, or existence, consciousness. Sound and accommodation would be on the same order, impacting awareness, you understand? So, but the scripture is clearly established that consciousness has no properties. So everything else has properties, but satya, conscious existence, has no properties. Okay, properties happens when duality comes into place, when Ishvara or Maya turns non-duality, into diversities, and then whenever there is many parts, and then we have what? We have many properties. Okay, so our true nature is that which is free. It's absolutely free from anything other than itself. Therefore, there is no question of any property. Property comes when you start mixing up things. By the way, in mithya, there is not a single product of mithya that is pure. Okay, and I think I have mentioned that in the past when I was studying. I loved metallurgy, and metallurgy. I became aware at the time that there was no way we could come up with a metal that was 100% pure. Because everywhere there is some inclusions of other elements. Careful examination of one's experience also reveals the fact that awareness does not modify as experience. Okay, so this is another feature of awareness. When we look into awareness and following the logic as presented by the scriptures, it's revealed that awareness does not change whenever in contact with an object of experience. So experience comes, the body changes, the mind changes, the vasanas change with experience, but the witnessing conscious principle called awareness does not change. And this, we can prove it by following the logic of Vedanta. If it did not modify, it would have, if it did modify, if awareness would really modify, it would develop certain properties and qualities and would lose its nature as free and independent consciousness. Okay, it would lose its properties of limitlessness, because whenever there is something other than myself, and a simple property or quality is already an inclusion. Because if there is something that is one without any inclusion, and then there is no question of qualities or properties. Something needs something else in order to have qualities. So if that would be the case, and then awareness would not be limitless. We would lose our nature, limitless nature, because there would be some other things making up attributes and qualities within conscious existence. So it never changed, and it's very interesting because it is the substrate of everything. It's what's lending existence to the world and consciousness to the jivas, but yet it's never ever modified. It's never changed. None of these properties of everything that exists in the universe touch this awareness, conscious existence principle that remains unaffected by anything it pervades. It's very intriguing, this concept of free and independent pervasiveness, pervading, making up the mirror on which the world shines, or the screen on which the world, the universe is projected. It yet remains absolutely free from the properties coming from the world. Since it does not borrow properties, it does not the properties from space, for example, does not jump into consciousness, although consciousness there giving existence to space, So it does not borrow property from space. Space must exist in a different order, and this order is called mithya. Otherwise, if it was on the same order again, what's the logic here? It would be passing to one another, okay? The property of existence is transferred to space. It's always, okay? Consciousness, awareness is transferred to space. It is the existence, the isness, transferred to space. Everything is because of existence, transferred to space. But space transfers everything without any problem and without interacting, without doing anything. It's just its nature. Its nature is lending existence to this relative or apparent order. So this mithya, if it was really impacting or somehow transferring some of its properties, for example, of accommodation and sound, if some of that would jump to the isness of existence, and then we could say space and existence are in the same order of reality. But that's not the case. Space belongs to mithya, must belong to a different order. Otherwise, it would be impacting satya. Otherwise, it would impacting our consciousness, our witnessing conscious, principle. We have this principle called consciousness, this factor called consciousness, and it's never affected by any of these properties belonging to the world. The world is meaning mithya. So if consciousness would really be affected by any of these properties coming from the mind, so to speak, or from the physical world, if it would be being affected, and then we could infer that they belong to the same order. But consciousness does not get effect, does not receive, does not take in none of these properties of the mind, of the intellect, jump to consciousness. Do you agree, Claudio, or not? You did not seem to be very, very sure about that.
Yes, of course I am.
Okay.
But this is nothing touches, absolutely nothing, never consciousness.
If you see space, akasha, and by extension, any element that derives from space, this fact should come to your mind, okay? So if anything we see, as I mentioned before, if we see space, if we see air within space, and then if we see the other elements coming out of air and so on, anything we see, derives, if we see space by extension, any element that derives from space, we should always keep in mind this understanding, So everything that is a phenomenon is a property of existence and not the other way around. Existence is independent, free and independent, and anything that is seen, everything is seen with properties is mithya, okay, and does not impact satya. So if we see akasha and by extension all other elements, we have to keep that in mind. Getting to this point may take continuous reflection on these arguments. So we are discussing a little bit more because these are subtle arguments. It's not going to be very appealing or attract to people with grosser intellects, let's say. If you have discrimination, you appreciate this three-stage logic. It's a tool, that we can keep in mind. If we have good mind, good discriminating mind, you will appreciate this three-stage logic immediately when you perceive an object. Okay, again, the object no longer deceives me. It's just a property of my self-existence. Okay, so I don't depend on the object. I'm not coming out of the object. Existence. I am a free and independent principle. Okay, and I lend existence to the properties of Mr. Maya, which is my best friend. So in the same way, I know what is mithya, and I never confuse myself with mithya. Mithya is any and everything that contains properties, any and everything that I can see and experience and know. So we have this three-stage logic. It's immediately working for us every time we interact with the world of object. This discrimination between the space and existence concludes. Then the verse 77 to 86 is going to do the same work, discriminating the other elements from the existence that apparently are coming out of this other object. So the next property of Maya, the next of these five elements is air. So we'll be looking into discriminating air from existence. The elements are capitalized to indicate the fact that at this stage of creation, the elements are subtle principles that are imperceptible to the sense. So the verse 77. When one is firmly convinced that space and self are not the same, one should differentiate the other elements from the self as well, using the same logic. So the space and consciousness discrimination is only relevant for people who think that Vedanta is a philosophy, because there is no logic to the argument that space is conscious and therefore the self. So what is being said here, and it sounds more like James and less like Swami P. If space and consciousness, this discrimination is relevant mostly to people who believe that Vedanta is a philosophy. So it's a very practical discrimination, and it says here, because there is no logic to the argument that space is conscious, meaning to say, how can you make a confusion between space and consciousness, the space and existence, okay? Space and myself, how can I make a confusion, okay? So why not? Because, space is not a sentient being. Space is never conscious. And as we know, existence and consciousness are like the two sides of the same coin. So therefore, if I know that I am conscious of space and space is not conscious of myself, and then I will never mix up space with myself, because I am the conscious principle. I exist, space exists, we both enjoy existence, but I not only exist, but I am a conscious being. Therefore, I know that space is something other than myself, okay? So space exists, but space is mithya, okay? Space is easily resolved in satya, but space is not conscious, is not a conscious principle, okay? Therefore, I don't need to be discriminate I and space, because it's clear to me that I am conscious of space, but space is not conscious of myself. Here the commentary went to the extent that to say that it's only relevant to the people who think that Vedanta is a philosophy. So I don't quite agree, but I understand the style. because it's relevant to most people in the Vedanta world who still can make a confusion between akasha, emptiness, space, and consciousness. Okay, but this is a good point. So how can you mix yourself and confuse yourself with space or emptiness or nothingness? Okay, so how can emptiness is seen by you, is experienced by you, is known by you, is witnessed by you, and how can you get mixed up? But it's not always clear to us that everything that is experienced cannot be myself. How many times we hear that? But yet, in the spiritual world, people fall for that again and again, even people who knows that Vedanta is not a philosophy. Why? Because it's Maya. Maya is a tough tricker, a trickist. And people, they go into that emptiness, that space, where there is nothing, and then they say, okay, so this is the end of the game. Here I found myself, I am space. How can you be space and emptiness if emptiness is not a conscious principle? You are the consciousness in which space or emptiness takes place. Isn't it that way, Mark? There is also no evidence that space exists apart from the idea of space. So space is an intellectual or conceptual principle or element or object, okay? So we can't really see and touch space. It is shapeless, formless. It's the most subtle principle in mithya. But by logic and inference, everybody, even the scientific communities, know that there is such a thing as space. And it seems that all objects, all phenomenal objects, they resolve themselves in space when they really analyze matter very carefully. There is also no evidence that space exists apart from the thought, idea, knowledge space. Space is only a concept. It's a conceptual object brought about because consciousness, under the spell of Maya, identifies with the body. Okay, now, this is a little bit subtler. It's saying here that space is only a concept brought about in the mind of the human jiva, because consciousness goes under the spell of Mr. Maya and then immediately identifies with the body. And then once consciousness becomes the jiva atma, and then what it sees other objects, okay, and sees a distance, and then it finds space and it finds time. Everything, space and time, comes into existence due to this avidya, in which consciousness contracts and identifies with the physical body, and then sees the other object, and then immediately it finds itself in space. That is the logic here. The space is only a concept brought about by avidya, which makes jiva atma identify with the body. When it does so, there seems to be a separation between the self and the objects appearing in it, okay? So the self under the spell of avidya becomes the jiva atma, okay? It still calls itself the self, okay? But then it sees a distance or separation between the self and the other objects in its environment, okay? This separation is expressed by the word, the space between me, aham, and idam, the world, this and that, okay? All objects rest in consciousness, in awareness. They are just knowledge thoughts. So all the other objects, not only the space, which is a conceptual object, which is somehow is derived by the human intellect in connection with the other objects perceived by the Jiva Atma that brings about the notion of space, the container of the entire universe. All objects rest in awareness. They are just knowledge or thoughts, but they seem to rest in space because the body is taken to be the self and to be real. The moment that the self identifies with the body, and then the objects, all, rather than appearing to be in awareness, they appear to be where? In space, okay? Because consciousness took itself to be the body and then produced the notion of space and time, and then the objects appear as in space time, okay? The timeline in space. So this is all conceptual, okay? Thoughts, knowledge. All objects rest in awareness, a beautiful sense. Everything is happening in consciousness, okay? Everything is reflected in this mirror of consciousness. All objects rest in awareness. They are just thoughts, knowledge, but they seem to rest in space because the body is taken to be the self. And they believe to be real. The body has a practical connection to space insofar as it evolved out of space. And then now, this paragraph is very beautiful. The body has a practical connection to space. So we are trying to understand here, this sounds like Swami P, and Swami, he's presenting one logic after the other, and then he's going to wrap it all together. The body has a practical connection to space. Why? Because it has evolved out of space, right? Space is the primary instrument, and then out of space, the other four elements came, and then the body is a configuration of these principles, that is this thought element. Since everyone has a body and identifies with the body on different degrees, the space consciousness distinction serves to objectify the body and therefore separate it from space, okay? So there is a huge confusion between even the body, I, myself, and space, also on the level that the body, evolved out of the space. It has a practical, intimate connection with space, and everybody has a body, and everybody identifies with the body. And then the space distinction, say this spatial and space consciousness distinction, this serves to objectify the body, okay? Because the body is space. When we are discriminating I consciousness and the body, I have to remember the body is a byproduct, or it's a grossification of the space element, okay? So if I believe I am a body, and then this discrimination between consciousness and myself is important because there is a subconscious connection between the body, the idea I, the body, and I space, because the body comes out of space. So far, so good? Anything from you? From the body's point of view, however, we cannot say that space is non-existent or even apparently existent. So when we stand in the body as the body, and then we cannot say that space is non-existent, okay? Or even an appearance, okay? Because it's so real, because I exist within space, my body, and I, the body, exists, from space. It is a materially existent all-pervading object. It's not a vacuum. It's not a void. It's not an emptiness. Space is a material, existent, all-pervading object. So it's an incredible object, and it has a lot of similarities with conscious existence because it is the most pervading principle in mithya. So from the standpoint, I am the body, I cannot negate space, and space is a material existent principle, and pervading everything, pervading every cell of my body. It's not a vacuum. It is the principle that provides accommodation to my body and all other bodies and objects. The teaching on existence reveals the fact that if space exists, the body exists insofar as space is the cause of the body, and an effect is just the cause in a new form. Okay, so the teaching on existence is also revealing the fact that if space exists positively, as an existing material, extremely subtle, if space exists, and then understanding the relationship between the space and I, the body, and I, consciousness. So it's going to reveal that if space exists, insofar the body exists, the body exists insofar as space is the cause, the body exists insofar the space is the cause of the body, and the body is an effect of space. And as an effect, it's going to become a cause in a new form, because the body, as we know, it goes back to the basic elements. Among the elements, there is the space elements. The body is going to turn back to the 5 elements, and it's going to be the cause again. If the inquirer can understand that the isness of space and the isness of consciousness and the isness of the body is the same isness of space, then the body can be accepted as the self without failing to the trap that the self is the body. So now here, Swamiji is just resolving everything. If we understand this principle, how everything unfolds from consciousness, from existence, from awareness, So if the inquirer can understand that the isness of all these principles, from the most subtle to the most dense, from space, from Maya, from space until the physical material universe. If the inquirer can understand the isness being one and the same, okay, consciousness and the space and the body, then the body can be accepted as the self. Why? Because all join the same non-dual existence. Okay, everything exists as existence. The isness of everything is the isness of Brahman that manifests itself even as physical object. Okay, so if we understand that, and then we can resolve even the body in consciousness as consciousness without mixing up or falling into the trap that the self is the world, the self is the body. No, the self is never limited to these superimpositions or these manifestations, produced apparent manifestations, okay? But everything can be resolved in the self as the self, in awareness as awareness, because everything comes from awareness. Perhaps the best argument against the reality of space and therefore the reality of the body is the fact that it is a non-object. This is now after I go about making very subtle inquiries and logics. So we present the simple fact, the simple sadhana. The best argument against the reality of space the reality of all other elements that come out of space, including the physical body, including our subtle body, you know. So the best argument may be what? Is the fact that all of these phenomenal objects, they are known to me, but they do not know me, okay? Is this the simple such a mithya discrimination? It's all known object to me. The subject can never be objectified. The subject, the subject can never be objectified. It is conscious and objects are not conscious. So this is to simplify in the end, the entire analysis of experience. Vedanta is about analysis of experience. No? We are just following the logic, beautifully present. Any questions about that? Do you think this is philosophy, Claudio?
No, it helps. It helps because it's true. What he says, because if you discriminate space from consciousness, and it clears, because I think it's very easy to think to imagine consciousness like something big, you know, or it's very easy. I think, I don't know if I can explain, but with imagination you can imagine that consciousness is something big, but to be big, it is a property, so it's not big. It's not property.
There we go. Yeah.
Thinking and reflecting about this, I find it useful. I find it very useful.
Yeah, we can say that space is vast, but consciousness is not vast. You know, consciousness is free of any possible qualities or properties. You know, is the existence that somehow, you know, lends existence to Maya Ishwara, and then they can play with all these, cooking up all these objects, and the objects being a mix-up, a cocktail of different parts. You see, consciousness has a beautiful definition as well. We say that consciousness is whole, full, and complete. It's full, purna. But consciousness, existence, is a partless whole. If we have parts, for example, Jagata, when we look at the universe, usually we call the world, we call our planet. So our planet, when we say the world is one, and it's true. We have this beautiful planet, it's a living being, as we know, it's a living being, and it's one. And then, but it is composed of many parts, numberless parts. But consciousness is said to be a partless purna, a partless whole. There is no part to it. And this partless principle, aspect or feature of consciousness, it is what allows it not to have any attribute or property, because it's one without a second. So there is nothing more than consciousness, and then, oh no, okay, no, let me call my other parts here. So a tree, as we know, has several parts, a dog has many parts, but consciousness being the substrate, and that goes again, the confusion with space, because the space is also full. It's whole, it pervades everything, but then we need to understand that space, okay, number one, is not a conscious principle. Number two, is a byproduct of something else, and it is defined by its properties, okay? And space is a big guy, it's the big, but it's vast. But Brahman Satchitananda is not vast, it's beyond space. Vastness goes for infinite space, and so on. The pervasiveness of awareness. Verse 78. Awareness is all pervasive. Maya is dependent on awareness and is more limited than awareness, but less limited than Maya's effects, such as space. The space and the elements that evolve from space. Air is more limited than space because it is an effect of space, but it's more pervasive than fire, which evolves from it. So now we are being presented with the picture of consciousness as this most subtle of the subtle, that which is all pervasive, that which exists as the only reality, okay? And when we say that Jesus is real, is something that exists and exists all the times, never modify, and exists without depending on any other factor or principle. Now, reality is that which exists at all times and never changes, and it's free and independent. It's not depending on anything in order to be reality, okay? In order to be the isness. So awareness is all pervasive. And then he says, Maya is a big thing, you know, very powerful, which is something that somehow is said to be associate, but not really associate with awareness, because awareness is associateless. Okay, Maya associates to consciousness somehow, and then produce. Everything is associated with consciousness because we depend on consciousness, awareness for our existence and our conscious sentience. So Maya is dependent on awareness. Awareness is free from Maya, independent. No? And here it said that Maya is more limited than awareness. So I would just say that awareness is limitless. So therefore, more or less limit than awareness is a strange sentence here in this. So what it says here is that Maya, although Maya is very, very subtle, okay, and has the power to bring about the 5 elements in association with pure sattva, you know, Maya is the most subtle. It's even subtler than space, okay? Maya is really subtle, okay? It's the prakriti on which the universe shines, okay? So Maya depends on awareness, and it is, but is less subtle than awareness, rather than say it's more limited. So that which is less subtle or is denser or more gross, okay, is more limited. We will see as the elements grossify, they grossify by taking some aspects, some features of the subtler elements and adding up to themselves. And then like that, they become more and more dense. And as they become more dense, they are more limited. They are limited also, and mostly because they depend on so many other factors. Understand? So Maya depends on awareness, and Maya is less subtle than awareness. But it is much more subtle than its effects. The effects of Maya, as we know, are the 3 gunas, the 3 energies, and then the 5 subtle elements. So it's less subtle than awareness, but it's more subtle than its effects, meaning to say space. So Maya is more subtle than space. Space is denser than Maya. Therefore, Maya is more limited. So what is this talk about limitation and density of energy? So something that is the most subtle, it somehow pervades everything. And then it becomes a little bit more denser, okay? And then what Maya is going to do is Maya is going to pervade the space and all other elements, okay? And then space is going to pervade all the other 4 elements, but space is denser than Maya. Space cannot pervade Maya. Therefore, there is a limitation in space due to its density, okay? It's not subtler than Maya, okay? Maya is less subtle than awareness, but it is more subtle than space, air, and so on. So space is going to pervade air, therefore it's more free, it's more limitless, you know? But air is a little bit denser. Air cannot pervade space. You understand? So it's the other way around, therefore, air is going to be more limited, okay? So it's space and the elements that evolve out of space, they are less subtle or more limited than Maya, okay? Air is more limited than space, because space is subtler, because it is an effect of space, as I just said. But air is more pervasive than fire. As we know, air is going to pervade the fire, okay, which evolves from itself, air, and etc. Yeah? Did we get that one? Okay, we got a little bit more here. Verse 79. The properties of air are ability to absorb moisture, perceptibility to the touch, and the power or the energy to move. Existence and the properties of Maya and space are also found in air. So we are looking at air now. And then air, what we get from existence to air, we get the isness of existence, okay? The isness of existence and the properties of Maya. Maya has a very, very intriguing property of its own. I think you guys have heard about that. What is the property of Maya? Anybody remembers?
So accommodation.
Yeah.
Or is that space? Yeah. Properties of
Yeah, the Maya has a very unique property of its own. Of course, it has existence, but existence it gets from existence itself. The isness of Maya comes from existence, but Maya has a unique power or property, which is appearance, the power to appear, seminess, okay? Maya is that power that exists that makes things appear, things that do not really exist. Isn't it amazing? Yeah? It's the very property of Maya. So existence and the properties of Maya and the property of space are also transferred to air. So everything is passed on. Huh? So how so the air is borrowing the property of Maya called appearance? Because the air is going to appear as well. It's the magic show does not stop with space. The magic show from Maya, the property of Maya, meaning to say seminess. Well, I think seminess is the word. You know, it's transferred to all other. Everything is going to appear to exist. Yeah? There's this mithya. Yeah? Air has 4 properties. The existence of air, the isness of air is borrowed from existence, consciousness itself. Yeah? Its accommodative nature and the property of sound is borrowed from space. So the air is going to accommodate things as well. Okay, so it's more pervasive than physical material. Yeah? So when you go into a space, if there is a lot of air, So it's going to accommodate us. It's a little denser, it's not going to penetrate all cells or aspects of our body, but it's quite accommodating. And it has a property of sound that it's borrowed as well from space. Its unique property, the property of air, is what? The ability to be perceived by touch. We know that when we go like that with our body, if there is a lot of air in front of us, there will be resistance. So the aeroplane and the car, in order to go, is going to have to break through the resistance of air. So air offers a resistance, and we can feel it by touch. Awareness has one property, meaning to say isness, existence. Maya has two properties. One is isness or existence, and the other is mithya, which is seminess. Space has 3, and air has 4. So air has got all of these properties, the property of isness, and then the properties of Maya, and then the property of space, and then altogether the air has 4 properties. Air exists and appears in space. Gradually, Maya's projection is taking shape. The more parts an object enjoys, the more obvious it should be that it's not real. So everything comes from the more subtle, and it's the properties are being transferred to a more denser and a more denser principle that evolves. And then these other objects, they are going to have more properties. Here was presented as parts, but the more properties an object has, more obvious it is for someone doing this inquiry that it should not be real. Why? Because it's more and more configured by different parts and properties, okay? The more parts and properties the principle enjoys, the more obvious it should be for us that this object is not real, meaning to say that it does not stand alone. So what is the definition of reality? Is that which exists at all times, never change, and exists independently of any other factor or principle, okay? And we know that the denser the object is, more obviously to us, the Vedantins, to determine that it's not real, and it's not really why? Because it enjoys a certain existence, but it depends on so many factors. It does not stand alone, like the ring does not stand alone because it depends on the gold. Likewise, these other objects, the more it evolves from space, the more they do not stand alone, the more they depend on many other factors. Therefore, it's not real, because the very definition of reality is that which it enjoys existence, never changing, and never depending on any other principle. Air occupies a part of space. So space is there, some areas there is air, some others does not have air. The addition of properties to subsequent elements is not an actual change. So the addition of properties that go from these more subtle elements to the others, to the subsequent elements, is not an actual change. It's not that they change. What is an actual change? You just take what? You just take milk and turn it into cheese. That is an effective actual change that cannot be reversed, okay? The addition of properties to subsequent elements is not an actual change, parimana karyan, of the original element. The original element remains the same, intact, but it somehow it pervades the others, without really being transformed in the other. The same way consciousness, pervades the world, never being transformed into the world as the world. Therefore, we say the world can be said to be awareness, but awareness is never going to be said to be the world, okay? Because it was not changed into the world. It just appears as the world. So this addiction, this transfer that's going to bring about these subtle elements is of the nature of vivarta karyan. It's an appearing change, okay? It appears to change, but does not really change, okay? Understood? That is the very definition of mithya. And that's why everything can be resolved back into awareness, consciousness, existence. Okay, we stay here. And we meet again this coming Thursday with the Drisha Viveka. Thank you for your presence and participation. We meet again. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purna Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, my friends. Arrivederci.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Arlen.
How you say
Beautiful-
goodbye? Huh?
Beautiful satsang. Thank you.
Oh, yes, I enjoyed it very much. Mark, how you say goodbye in Spanish?
Adios or
Adios.
hasta luego.
Hasta luego. Yeah, hasta luego. Yeah.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.